Today, we're diving into a pop culture phenomenon, but probably not for the reasons its creators were hoping for. We're going to look at the spectacular, almost unheard of critical failure of a big-budget TV show called All's Fair. And we're going to try to figure out how something with so much money and talent behind it could get it so wrong.
Right. Let's not beat around the bush here. The verdict from professional critics came in fast, and it was absolutely brutal. This wasn't a situation with some mixed reviews, some people liked it, some didn't. No, this was a completely unified front of just pure, unfiltered condemnation.
And this is the number that tells the whole story. On one of the biggest review sites out there, the show is sitting at a critic score of 0%. That doesn't just mean it's unpopular, it means that out of every single professional review they counted, not a single one was positive. It's kind of a perfect score, just in the worst possible way.
And that, right there, is the big mystery we're unpacking in this explainer. You've got a major streaming service backing it, a creator with a history of massive hits, and a globally famous star in the main role. So how on earth does a show like that fail so completely in the eyes of the very people paid to watch and review it?
So first, let's just really soak in the sheer scale of this critical catastrophe. It wasn't just that the critics didn't like the show. It was the words they used, the language. It showed a rejection that went way deeper than just bad TV.
I mean, the level of creative insults here is just stunning. Critics called it everything from a crime against television to, get this, fascinatingly existentially terrible. Just think about that for a second. It's not just bad, it's bad on an existential level. Another one called it a tacky, revolting monument to greed, while someone else summed it all up as a non-stop montage of women enjoying stolen wealth. This kind of language tells you something really important. This wasn't just about a bad plot or some clunky acting. This was a deep, almost philosophical rejection of what the show stood for. So, how does any show manage to earn that much hatred? What were the actual parts that caused such a massive, universal backlash? Well, according to the reviews, we can break down the anatomy of this failure into 3 main pieces. And it all starts with a basic idea. The show's about an all-female divorce law firm. They only represent women. Now, on the surface, that sounds fine, right? But the twist, the part the critics really latched onto, was that their whole mission was to win these gigantic settlements, a lot of the time from men who the show kind of implies haven't really done anything wrong. So the critics pretty quickly slapped it with the label Girlboss Fantasia. And this quote just perfectly captures that disconnect. The critics basically said that while the show thinks it's telling this powerful story about female empowerment and getting justice, what we're actually seeing on screen feels a lot more like a celebration of greed, vanity, and just plain cruelty, all packaged up to look like a series of insta-boasts. Okay, next up in this anatomy of a disaster, the performance of its star, Kim Kardashian. It's hard to find a review that doesn't aim a huge amount of criticism directly at her acting. Wow. That quote is especially savage, but honestly, it captures what a lot of them were saying. Over and over, you see her performance described with words like stiff, affectless, and feckless. The Hollywood Reporter might have put it best when they called her an appropriately wooden lead for an empty drama, which kind of suggests her performance was the perfect, hollow match for the material itself. But look, you can't get a 0% just because of one performance. Beyond the acting, critics absolutely tore apart the script. They pointed to dialogue and plot points that they felt weren't just poorly written, but were actually kind of insulting. Critics felt like the show wasn't even a real story, but more like, and I'm quoting here, a tsunami of clunking cliches and just disconnected scraps of sassy one-liners. And that led to an even deeper criticism. This feeling that the show had a really low opinion of its viewers, that it just assumed the audience would be happy to see flashy clothes and lazy stereotypes about men and women. Okay, but this is where the whole thing gets way more complicated, and honestly a lot more interesting. The show's failure wasn't just bad acting or bad writing. Many people are arguing it was about a huge ideological miscalculation, which leads to this really fascinating contradiction. And that's the million-dollar question that at least one commentator brought up when they were looking at the fallout. I mean, think about it. For the last 10 years or so, we've seen so many stories about female empowerment, celebrating these girl boss characters and framing everything as women beating men. This show gave us exactly that, on a silver platter. So why was this the one that got so violently rejected? So, a commentator we looked at for this explainer has a pretty provocative theory. What if the show didn't fail because it was a bad version of a girl boss story? What if it failed because it was a brutally honest one? The whole argument is that the show accidentally stripped away all the heroic fantasy stuff and just showed the raw, pretty unflattering core of the ideology itself.
This chart does a great job of laying out that conflict. On the left, you've got what the show promised. It promised female empowerment. But what did critics say they saw? A celebration of greed. It promised strong, independent women. What did critics see? Insufferable thornbacks, which is a pretty nasty term for older, unmarried women. It promised justice for women, but seemed to be all about stealing from innocent guys. And finally, the show claimed its characters were changing the game, but the critics said, no, they're just exploiting a system that's already rigged.
And this quote from that same commentator really just sums up their whole point. The theory is that the show held up a mirror to the ugliest parts of an ideology that critics usually support, and they absolutely hated what they saw. It wasn't that the show was a caricature, it was that it felt a little too close to the truth for comfort, and so they reacted by calling it a monster. So, what's the big takeaway here? The total implosion of All's Fair isn't just about one bad show. It really works as this fascinating cautionary tale about the exact cultural moment we're living in right now. So what does a failure like this really show us? Well, first, it definitely shows there are limits to using celebrity as a replacement for actual acting ability. Second, it's a pretty strong signal that people might be getting tired of that shallow, materialistic brand of empowerment that feels really stuck in the last decade. But maybe most importantly, it could signal a real shift in what critics, and maybe audiences too, are willing to buy as social commentary. The story of All's Fair is like a snapshot of a moment when the cultural script suddenly and very, very loudly changed. And that leaves us with this one last, pretty provocative thought. When something is rejected this completely, is it all the fault of the creators for making a bad product? Or does it also reveal something deeper about the audience and the critics and the kinds of stories they just aren't willing to believe in anymore? It really is a question about that thin line between the fantasies we want and the unflattering truths we sometimes don't.